Check how many times I've been arrested in the last 8 years. But no reason. Try to kill me, because all the is trying to kill me. They was all trying to kill me. Now I'm shooting at everything.
I said, no one's gonna help me. I'm gonna have to take care of this myself. And I still feel guilty about this part. And I pray to God my son never sees this. But I was gonna shoot him in the back of the head. I had in my mind, this is the only way to stop him. I was gonna take him out to the woods, and I was just gonna put one in his head and leave. And I was going to be okay with going to jail. I knew it was wrong, but I had to do it.
Cleveland Heights police officer Jason West was shot and killed while responding to a street fight.
Police say the shooter is 27-year-old Timothy Halton.
Wow, oh my God. There's a ambulance down here now. Get down, man. The officer shot the innocent ambulance. That went on the way.
It's chilly. Oh my goodness. Can I have a minute, please? Oh, wait. Oh my God, why? That's what I tried to prevent. Timmy was my big, sweet teddy bear that morphed into a monster. I love my son dearly, but if I would have killed him, Jason West would still be alive. Bad this is gonna sound, but if it were Timmy that was killed, I would have preferred that. You did what I thought you were going to do, and I couldn't stop it. And it's hard to wrap your head around it because he's still my baby. He's still my baby, and now he's a murderer. As a parent, you always blame yourself. You always question, did I do enough? What could I have done different? I mean, he was just so adorable. And those cheeks that he had, you know, growing up, his cheeks, everybody would just squeeze. I have a lot of happy memories. I just have a lot of sad ones, too. I had no desire to have children. None whatsoever. It was not in my plans. I just wanted to go to school. I didn't tell anybody at first that I was pregnant. My mom wanted to know by whom, and I told her the organist at the church. And so I had to get married to save the church embarrassment, to save me embarrassment. It was nothing to be happy about. The way I looked at my unborn child is, how am I gonna love this baby when I don't want kids? I'm a kid myself. But then they put that baby on my chest, and it just, I felt the joy of motherhood then. I did. I just instantly loved him. And I told him, I want to protect you with everything I can. Nobody's gonna hurt you. You're my baby. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh, 16, my little baby. I felt this love and I had never felt before. And I was so happy with this part of my life. I devoted all my time to him. Married at 16, 2 kids by 17, divorced at 18. I didn't know how to do this thing. I didn't know how to raise children. They were being raised along with me. I just knew I had to love them. I knew I had to protect them. I go upstairs, and check on them, and he's not in the bed. I was scared. I was like, what happened? I ran all over the house looking for him. I ran everywhere, checking the bathrooms. I had never been so scared in my life because I'm thinking the worst. And then, I don't know, an inner voice said, look in the closet. And I looked, and I see my clothes are pulled down. And then I see his hand sticking out. He was all curled up but the clothes, he had pulled my clothes down to make a blanket. So he was covered up. And I felt such a relief. I wake him up, make sure he's okay. And I'm trying to talk to him, and it's like he's looking past me. And I'm like, what is wrong with him? I don't know how to explain it, but I had the weirdest feeling. Eventually, it just became an every night thing. I would see him walking down the hallway, and I would follow him, and I would talk to him. He wouldn't say anything. And his face, it was just a blank stare. Just a blank stare. And it made me question, is there a demon in there? I know there's God, I know there's the devil as well. I was terrified. One day, I smelled something really foul, and I'm looking around. Finally, I check under the bed, and it's just a shoe box, and the smell is stronger. And I open up the shoebox, and there's a bird inside, dead, cut open. Oh, it disgusted me. That disgusted me. It really freaked me out because it's like, why is there a dead bird in a box with a knife under my son's bed? What is he doing? And so finally I called him in and I asked him, what is this? And he didn't answer me at first. And I said, Timmy, this bird is dead and cut open. I said, did you do this? And he said, yes, I did it. I was just putting it out of its misery. I just did not want to think that my son could be cruel. I was totally freaked out because this is not normal. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal. It kept happening. It kept happening. So, of course, I'm like, oh, this is bigger than I thought. And I did not have a clue of what to do, and I was frightened. I just knew something was wrong with my son. Because I had heard that, like, psychopaths, they start off by killing animals. I never asked if he regretted it or felt bad. I was really scared to talk about it with him. I was afraid. I didn't want to hear what the answer was really going to be. but I didn't want him to say, oh, I have fun doing this. I like the blood squirting out. I didn't know what was going to be said, so I just didn't ask. I knew something was wrong with my son, but I didn't know what. And it was like, well, maybe it is a demon. I made every excuse up you can. That's what parents do. That's what mothers, especially, that's what we do. We will make up an excuse and stick with it. We love our babies so much, and we want the best for them. We don't want to think the worst, but I didn't know what was coming next.
Halton is accused of shooting and killing Cleveland Heights police officer Jason West. Officer West never pulled a gun on Halton. He did not have the chance. Halton shot Officer West as he arrived on scene.
I do still cry about it because it wasn't the life I had planned for my child. I mean, no one wants their child to be a killer. It was kind of shocking to the system and something I'll never get over. You see the light we're approaching is right after the next light. There's a sign in memory of investigator Jason D. West. I drive past it going to work and coming from work. Because he lived in one of these houses here. You know, that sign may not mean anything to a lot of people, and it means a lot. That sign is there because my son killed him. I say a quick prayer and drive right past it. My babies. Oh my God. So adorable. In his little suit, her little dress. I used to love dressing them up. He was such a happy kid. So happy, so polite, so loving. He and his sister were so close. And she loved her brother. They were best friends. They were. But then he changed. I'm getting her ready for her bath, and she has a bunch of marks on her thighs. I asked her, what is this? Did you get bitten by something? And she's just like, no. And she tried to cover up real quick. And after a long pause, she said, Timmy made this shocking toy, and he shocks me. Like, what do you mean shocks you? He burns me. And he told me if I tell you, he was gonna get me. He had tied her to the chair, and I don't know how he did it, but he would take wires out of a radio and he would shock her. It became real in that moment, because now you're hurting your sister, physically abusing her. I didn't want to whoop my children, but there was no stopping me. You're getting whooped. Even whooping him. He had no emotion. He had no emotion. You spank him, and it's not one of those things where I'm gonna keep spanking you harder just to make you break. But no, he was very emotionless. After I whooped him, I just went in my room and cried. It was really hard for me to handle that I gave birth to someone that would be so cruel as to do this, and I just couldn't understand it. It's not exactly what I was dreaming of as a parent. a couple weeks later, I come home early from work, and she's in a chair. I said, is he shocking you? Is he doing it again? And she said, yeah, mommy, yeah, mommy. And then Chrissy told me, as he was shocking her, the louder she yelled or screeched, the more he laughed about it. It was a range of emotions, from fear to hurt that she's going through this to anger. So I tried to talk to him, but I was trying to get down to the bottom of it. Why do you like hurting things? Why? Why do you like inflicting pain? What kind of joy are you getting here? And he would just look at me. I don't know why. I don't know why. I would never get an answer. I was like, this is not normal. What is wrong with my son? I was terrified because no parent, first of all, wants their child to be bad, but to be violent, and for no reason other than the reason that's in his head. There was a time where the family could say, oh, we have to pray it away, we have to pray it away, we gotta pray that demon away. You know, but they wanted to do literally an exorcism, you know, in the church. I know there's a God, and I believe there's hell also. There was something evil inside of him. It's my baby. Okay. Hello?
Hello, this is a free call from an inmate at the Allen Correctional Institution.
Hey, baby.
Hey, Ma, how you doing?
I'm doing good. What's up?
Not much. I miss you.
I miss you too. I miss you too. I have to get your food box for you. I haven't forgotten.
Oh, okay. I love you.
I love you too. I miss my hugs.
Yeah, I need one right now.
You hear me right now? Okay, thank you. Yeah, what you been up to?
I ain't been up to nothing. How you been?
I've been okay. I've been good. Just doing little projects, you know, around the house and everything.
Oh, okay.
All right, baby. I'm gonna get back to work now, okay?
All right, I love you.
I love you too. Bye-bye. Talk to you soon.
Go ahead and sleep. So he knows.
All right, this is take 2, ABC Mark.
He knows what you're doing, right?
No.
He doesn't know what you're doing? So you're gonna tell him now? You're not telling him that you're doing this interview. Why?
Well, my son is very sensitive, and I know for a fact he's ashamed and embarrassed of the things he did. I know it hurts him, and this will hurt him.
So once again, you're a mother protecting him.
I have to. I have to protect my baby. He's gonna be 45 on March 30th. He's still my baby, though. You never stop loving them. You do a lot of forgiving and hope they forgive you for the things, you know, as a parent that you might have done wrong or that they didn't agree with. But no, you never stop loving them. It just breaks my heart that he's in there and he's never coming home. I received a call at work. It was the principal of the school, and they requested that I come up immediately. And I was like, well, what's wrong? What's going on? We'll talk to you when you get here. By the time I got there, he's sitting in a straitjacket in a chair that's locked down to the floor. I just saw a little baby in a straitjacket. Are you serious? But I'm scared because I'm like, what did you do? So apparently, one of the teachers asked him about his father, which was a sore subject with him. And he just tackled her. So security got him off her. He's kicking, screaming, throwing things, tearing up the desk and everything. And they ended up putting him in a straitjacket. Mind you, it's a school for children with behavioral issues, so they're used to seeing things. But they said this was extreme. My son was violent. Oh, this one, I think he's about 15 on this picture. And all of a sudden, he was happier. He had finished all his high school courses, and a teacher submitted an application for college, and he was accepted. Timmy said, "Don't tell my mom, I want to tell her." So he came home and told me. He was so excited. And he was on cloud nine. He was on cloud nine. He said, "Finally, I did something right." I was so proud of him. And he was so happy that I was proud of him because he had caused me so much heartache and pain. It gave me so much hope. It was like, finally, it was the time where I was like, okay, he's getting it together. He started getting violent, and with each episode, the violence was worse than the last time. And it just kept escalating and escalating. Well, you're really trying to make me cry, aren't you? A slow, violent descent. Okay. They have here his run-ins with the law. Bare-chested Timothy Halton Jr. punches and kicks a 60-year-old man who walks past his home. The man is hit on the side of the head, his jaw, and side. Halton yells at the bloodied man to get out of here. At this time, he's 20 years old, and they would hang out at the mall, and he just started punching people in the head for no reason. This was an incident just the next day, July 9th, 2000. Police get a call from Halton's screaming sister who has locked her brother out of the house. Disorderly conduct charge is later dismissed. That was part of the problem. No matter what he did, no matter who he hurt, they dismissed him. He just got one slap on the wrist after another. So I'm sitting there. They bring him in, and he's in a straitjacket. And I thought, well, what did he do to get back in the straitjacket? He told me he had been attacking the nurses. And I'm trying to act like, okay, this is normal. Okay, I'm just happy to see him. They kept it at a short visit, and it was time to go. And they said I had to leave first. So I started walking away, and all of a sudden I hear all this commotion. And Timmy's straitjacketing and all is knocking people out. He was just like using his shoulders and his head and kicking and literally attacking everyone. And I asked the doctor, he just said, "We suspect your child has schizophrenia." We're not for 100% sure, but we believe he might be suffering from schizophrenia. But I will never forget that face and the way he looked back. It was not my son. I swear to God, and it's so hard to make anyone believe, but I was looking at a devil. I look at pictures of Timmy all the time, especially when he was younger. I love looking at his baby pictures because he was so fat and chubby and adorable, of course. Mothers, we don't think our kids ever grow up. We still keep them as a baby. I'm still thinking this is my sweet Timmy. My son was morphing into something I did not recognize. It just wasn't Timmy, it's two people there. He was always sweet. He was always polite. He was always kind. He would morph into a whole different being. I mean, the way he walked, the way he talked, the way he looked at you. It was scary. You are always on edge because you know something's going to happen. You can never let your guard down. At this time, there were many episodes. He would walk around the house just screaming. It was an awful, awful, awful sound. It was so scary. He punched holes throughout my entire house. My daughter was terrified of him at this time, and she had the new baby. And at this point, she was scared to sleep alone. So her and the baby would sleep with me. So that's when we started going to the bathroom together. Me, her, and the baby. We'd get in that bathroom. It was nice that we slept in that bathroom. Because each episode was worse than the last. My daughter couldn't stand living with him out of fear. She said, "Mommy, he's gonna get us if we kick him out." This situation was so hopeless. I was like, my daughter can't live like this. I have a granddaughter now. She's not gonna go through what my daughter went through. I bought a gun because I needed to protect my daughter. It was gonna be Timmy or Chrissy. I just rushed home, and when I got there, I see blood on the wall. And I got my gun out my purse, and I was listening at the same time as I was walking up the steps. I didn't know if he was still in the house. I just knew there was blood on my wall. And so I go to the bedroom, and I'm at the door. And I don't want to twist this doorknob, but I know I have to, because I didn't know what I was going to see behind that door. So my hand was on the door for like seeing before eternity. And I just twisted and opened it. I didn't see anything. And I'm like, Chrissy. She said, "Mommy, I'm in here. I'm in the cubby hole." We made a cubby hole. And so I slid the fake wall away, and she's like, "I don't know where Timmy is, Mommy. I don't know. He was howling. He was acting strange. He kept saying he was coming after me." And so I had me and the baby hid in here. At that time, she had already called 911. When the police got there, they searched the house, they searched around the house, they couldn't find Timmy, but they found a cut-up cat. And that's where the blood came from. I was beyond words. It's not getting better, it's worse. And you have no conscience about it. That scared me in itself. It got to the point where I was so powerless. I felt like I am losing my mind. And I said, no one's gonna help me. I'm gonna have to take care of this myself. Tell him, come on, let's go for a ride. And we're driving and we're talking and everything. And my plan was to just go sit. It's a park called Forest Hills. And we were just gonna go sit there as we did often. And I was gonna, Timmy, look over there, look over there. I couldn't face him and do it. Not that it made it any better. I was gonna shoot him in the back of the head. This isn't something I wanted to do. This is something I felt I had to do. I kept picturing my daughter and picturing my daughter. But I literally had it pointed at him, and I was a good shot. My hands were trembling, and I just dropped it. Fell to my knees. And I remember letting out this horrible scream. I mean, it just came out of me. And he runs back, and he's like, Mommy, what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong? He didn't understand why I was crying. I never told him. But at that point, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Even in the best circumstances, parents always question, did I do the right thing? Did I make a mistake by doing this? Why couldn't you stop him? You don't know what you're going to do until you're in that position, until you have to address something. And at times you still don't know what you're going to do, but you try to make the best decision. It seemed like no matter what I did, I was wrong. It's not getting better, it's worse. I could have stopped it. If I would have killed him, then Jason West would still be alive. That's when the judge put him on probation, a 4-year probation, where he had to stay medicated, monitored, stay off drugs, alcohol, see his psychiatrist, social worker, counselor, whoever, take a drug test. And if he didn't do that, he was going to jail. That would be a violation of his probation, and he would go straight to jail. Yeah, that was a miracle. And I noticed the big difference. He worked 6 days a week. He was so proud of himself. He bought a brand new car. He finally moved out of my house, bought clothes, had a girlfriend, and it just made me feel so good. I was like, finally. After 1 year, he came home. He's like, they took me off probation. And I said, well, what does that mean? So I called the probation officer and I said, what do you mean he's off probation? He's thriving on probation. He's finally got somewhat of a life. And she said, well, that's why he's doing so good. He doesn't need to be on probation anymore. And I said, well, what about his medication? What about his shots? Oh, that ends too. I was like, are you serious? Don't you have his records. If you don't get his records. I said, look it over, reconsider, please. Reconsider. You're gonna keep letting my son go until he kills somebody. And that's exactly what's gonna happen. He's gonna kill somebody. His childhood friend called me, I think it was around 8:30, on Saturday morning. And he's like, Timmy shot a cop last night. Timmy shot, I'm like, what? Timmy shot a cop. We don't know where he is. We don't know where he is. He ran off. We don't know. And I let out this scream. The news said that he was still at large. And so I called Cleveland Heights Police, and I told them who he was. You know, I said, that's my son, Timothy Halton. I called the police station to turn my son in because it's murder. I mean, he killed someone, and it may not have stopped there. And there was no way I could deny that at that point, I'm the mother of a cop killer, and my son killed someone. I just started crying on the phone, and I said, sir, I'm sorry for your loss. He said, I'm sorry for yours too. It was chilling. I could still feel the chills now. It was very chilling, and that was it. He just hung up. I'm sorry for yours too.
Y'all said that I tried to kill a cop who just tried to run into my truck, pulled me in the driveway, blocked me off, jumped out, and pulled his gun on me. All crazy, for no reason.
Halton at times saying he didn't do anything, other times saying he acted in self-defense, then admitting his crime.
I let off 3 in the mother face. Is that what you want to hear? Hell yeah.
Wow.
What do you see when you look at that picture?
How am I looking at this picture of this grown man, and I just see my baby. Still see my little baby in his eyes. A lost life. I know people are gonna hate me when I say this, but I see a victim as well. I do, and I don't care who gets mad, but I shouldn't have had to have begged and pleaded and ran all around the city to try to get a shot to prevent him from hurting people. How is that acceptable in society? After the incident, I was fearful of retaliation from my whole family. I mean, he's behind bars and we're still out here. And I would be so ashamed. I would walk with my head down, hoping they didn't recognize me because my face was plastered everywhere, you know, and I couldn't sleep at night. I was terrified. I was scared for him as well. He's the monster. I'm the monster's mother. It's an awful feeling. It's something that you never get over, you know, for the family, for Jason's family. You know, I remember his birthday, February 10th. I grieved for his mother on Mother's Day. His sister, he had one sister just like my daughter. I feel for them because there's nothing I can say or do to bring Jason back. It's just an awful feeling. It's not a day that goes by that I don't think about it, them, what happened, my son, and his situation. I'll always question what was in his mind because I've never gotten a clear answer. Is my son evil or is he mentally ill? And can you explain the difference? No one wants their child to murder anyone. You never think of that as part of the possibilities when they grow up and become a teenager, get a girlfriend, get married, have children themselves. As awful as it sounds, I wish that Timmy had died that night instead of Jason. That would have been a better outcome. A better outcome. For everybody. And I'm not proud to say that, but it's the truth.
Nobody in the town could agree on the exact moment fear arrived. Some said it started with the sirens. Others said it was the image taped across every storefront window by sunrise. A smiling 17-year-old girl with feathered brown hair, braces barely visible behind a shy grin, eyes fixed forever in the glow of an old-school portrait. Missing. Last seen Friday night. Call this number immediately. But the people who were there remember something else. They remember the truck. Parked crooked near the edge of the Miller property, just after midnight. Engine cold. Driver's door hanging open. Headlights still faintly glowing into the dark Texas brush like two dying eyes. No blood. No body. No scream heard by neighbors. Just silence stretching across miles of empty road. And a cold wind moving through the fields. By the time deputies arrived, the entire town of Ash Creek had already started writing its own theories. Runaway. Drugs. Secret boyfriend. Kidnapping. Satanic panic. The rumors spread faster than facts ever could. It was Texas, summer of 1998, the kind of place where everybody knew your father's name before they knew yours, where church bells mattered more than police scanners, where doors stayed unlocked because nobody wanted to believe evil lived nearby. They were wrong. Her name was Emily Harper. Straight A student. Varsity volleyball. Worked weekends at a diner off Route 18. Never missed curfew. Never disappeared before. Her mother said Emily hated conflict so much she apologized when other people stepped on her shoes. And now she was gone. The deputies searched the roads first. Then the woods. Then the drainage ditches stretching behind abandoned ranch land. Helicopters circled low over dry fields. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through snake grass under brutal 98-degree heat. Every few feet someone shouted her name into the wilderness, as if the sound itself could pull her back alive. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. Just that abandoned truck sitting in the darkness like a message nobody could decode. Inside the cab, investigators found Emily's purse. Her wallet untouched. $32 still folded inside. Keys missing. One silver bracelet snapped near the passenger seat. Detectives photographed everything, bagged everything, documented everything, but almost immediately the case started collapsing into confusion. Because the timeline made no sense. Emily had left work at 9:47 p.m. Multiple co-workers confirmed it. She waved goodbye, climbed into her truck, and drove east toward home. 22 minutes later, she stopped at a gas station less than 10 miles from Ash Creek. Surveillance cameras captured grainy footage of her buying a Dr. Pepper and paying cash. She looked calm, relaxed, normal. Then she vanished. Between the gas station and the abandoned truck was a stretch of isolated county road barely 6 miles long. Somewhere in those 6 miles, Emily Harper disappeared off the face of the earth. The FBI arrived 4 days later. That changed everything. Suddenly, satellite trucks crowded the streets. Reporters swarmed outside the sheriff's office. National headlines exploded across television screens. Texas teen vanishes without trace. Small town hides dark secret. Missing girl cold case fears grow. And buried beneath all the panic was one detail investigators refused to release publicly. Someone had wiped the steering wheel clean. Not carefully. Not professionally. Just enough to remove obvious fingerprints. It was the first sign this wasn't random. Somebody had been inside that truck after Emily disappeared. Somebody had stayed calm enough to erase evidence. That realization poisoned the town overnight. Neighbors started locking doors. Parents stopped letting kids walk alone after dark. Men who had hunted together for years suddenly eyed each other across grocery aisles with quiet suspicion. Every strange glance became evidence. Every argument became motive. And investigators kept circling back to one uncomfortable possibility. Emily knew whoever took her. The profile fit. No robbery. No assault scene. No forced entry into the vehicle. No defensive wounds because there was no body. Statistically, predators rarely appeared out of nowhere on isolated roads without preparation. The FBI believed she likely stopped willingly or was intercepted by someone familiar. Which meant the killer, if there was a killer, had probably attended the same football games, eaten at the same diners, Maybe even joined the same church services as the volunteers searching for her. The thought sickened people. Then came the first real break. The sneaker belonged to Emily. But the discovery only deepened the nightmare. No blood nearby. No clothing. No remains. Just one shoe resting upright in the mud, as though carefully placed there. Search teams tore apart the entire area. Cadaver dogs reacted violently near the creek, barking toward dense brush before losing the scent completely near the highway. Investigators believed a body may have been transported through the area and moved again later. That possibility terrified detectives, because moving a victim required confidence, planning, control. This wasn't panic anymore. This looked deliberate. And then another detail surfaced. A witness came forward claiming he saw a man parked beside Emily's truck roughly 30 minutes before deputies discovered it abandoned. The witness described an older model blue pickup with damage along the rear bumper. White male, baseball cap, heavy-set build, no plate number, no clear face, but enough to ignite hysteria. Police received over 800 tips in less than 2 weeks. Ex-boyfriends, drifters, truckers, teachers. One caller insisted a local mechanic belonged to a cult. Another accused Emily's own father. Detectives chased every lead until exhaustion blurred into desperation. Still nothing. The sheriff at the time, Daniel Mercer, later admitted investigators were drowning. "We had too many suspects and zero evidence," he said years later. That's the kind of case that eats departments alive. And it did. Months passed. Then a year. The search parties disappeared first. Then the reporters. Then the billboards started fading under the Texas sun until Emily's face looked ghost-like against peeling vinyl. But her mother never stopped. Karen Harper drove the same stretch of county road every Friday night for nearly 11 years. Same route. Same time. Looking at ditches. Fence lines. Empty fields. Certain somehow her daughter was still waiting to be found. People in Ash Creek avoided eye contact when she entered stores, because grief that deep frightened them. By 2003, the investigation had officially stalled. Detectives labeled it a probable homicide without a body. Evidence boxes filled an entire storage room at the sheriff's office. Thousands of pages. Hundreds of interviews. Dead ends stacked on dead ends. The media gave it a new label. Cold case. 2 words capable of burying people alive. But Emily Harper refused to disappear completely. Teenagers who hadn't even been born when she vanished grew up hearing warnings about her case. Don't drive alone at night. Don't stop for strangers. Don't trust lonely roads outside town. Ash Creek carried her story like a scar. Then came the rumors about the neighbor. At first nobody paid attention because rumors in small towns were as common as dust storms. But over the years, one name surfaced repeatedly in quiet conversations nobody wanted recorded. Thomas Grady. Lived 3 houses down from the Harpers in 1998. 42 years old at the time. Divorced. Worked construction jobs across county lines. Kept mostly to himself. Known for staring too long at people during conversations. The kind of man residents described with the same unsettling phrase over and over again. Something felt off about him. But feeling off wasn't evidence. Grady had never been charged with violent crimes. No criminal history beyond a DUI and disorderly conduct complaint. Investigators interviewed him early in the case because nearly everyone close to Emily was questioned. He said he spent the night home alone watching television. No witnesses confirmed it. No evidence contradicted it. At the time, detectives moved on. Years later, some wondered if that was the biggest mistake of the entire investigation. Because hidden deep inside old interview transcripts was one chilling detail almost everybody overlooked. Thomas Grady claimed he never saw Emily the night she vanished. But another witness placed his truck near the gas station less than 15 minutes after Emily stopped there. The discrepancy sat unnoticed in storage for years. A forgotten contradiction buried inside thousands of pages. And while the case grew colder publicly, something else was happening behind closed doors. Evidence technology was evolving. DNA extraction methods became sharper. Digital enhancement improved old surveillance footage. Investigators across America started reopening impossible cases once considered permanently dead. Cold cases from the 70s suddenly produced arrests. Murderers who believed they escaped justice forever were being dragged into courtrooms by science itself. Families across the country watched miracles happen. Karen Harper watched too. Every breakthrough reopened her wound. Every solved case reminded her that Emily's remained unsolved. Then, in the winter of 2024, 27 years after Emily vanished into the darkness of that county road, Detective Luis Ortega reopened box number 14 inside the Ash Creek Evidence Archive. Inside were photographs no one had reviewed in over a decade. The abandoned truck, the bracelet, the shoe, and a blurry image taken from the gas station security camera at 10:06 p.m. Most investigators focused on Emily entering the store. Ortega focused on the background. A blue pickup truck parked beside pump number 3. Rear bumper damaged. Driver barely visible beneath a baseball cap. And suddenly, after 27 years, the entire cold case lurched violently back to life. Detective Luis Ortega stared at the frozen surveillance frame for nearly an hour without moving. The image quality was terrible even by 1998 standards. Static crawling across the screen, washed-out colors, timestamp flickering in the corner like a dying pulse. But the truck was there. Dark blue. Extended cab. Dent along the rear bumper, exactly where the witness described it 27 years earlier. The witness everyone ignored. Ortega enlarged the frame until the pixels broke apart into grainy blocks. The driver's face remained useless, buried beneath shadow and distortion, but one detail caught his attention immediately. A white decal stretched across the back windshield. 3 letters. Emikapachi. He checked old DMV registration archives the same night. Only 12 trucks in the county matched the make, color range, and approximate year. 4 had rear bumper damage listed in insurance claims. 1 belonged to a dead man. Another had been junked in 2004. 2 owners were cleared decades earlier. The 4th belonged to Thomas Grady. Suddenly the room felt smaller. Ortega reopened every interview connected to Grady. Thousands of pages scanned into digital format. He worked through the night, eyes burning under fluorescent lights, coffee turning cold beside stacks of evidence photos. And the deeper he dug, the worse it became. Grady had changed parts of his story multiple times. In his first interview, he claimed he stayed home all evening. In the second, he mentioned driving briefly to buy cigarettes. In a third interview months later, he said he may have passed near Route 18, but couldn't remember exactly. Detectives back then overlooked the inconsistencies because they were drowning in false leads. But viewed together, years later, the contradictions looked radioactive. And there was something else. A single line buried inside a supplemental report dated August 14, 1998. Witness observed suspect appearing unusually interested in volunteer search progress. Ortega leaned back slowly. Experienced investigators knew that behavior pattern. Killers inserting themselves into investigations. Hovering near searches. Asking questions nobody else asked. Watching panic unfold from the inside. Sometimes to relive the crime. Sometimes to monitor police. Sometimes because they simply couldn't stay away. The next morning, Ortega contacted the Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit. By afternoon, the Harper investigation officially reopened. Quietly. No press release. No public announcement. After 27 years, investigators understood one thing clearly. If Thomas Grady was involved, they couldn't risk spooking him. Because Grady was still alive. Still living in Ash Creek. Still driving through the same streets where Emily Harper vanished. The news hit Karen Harper first. Ortega visited her small white house just after sunset. Same house Emily grew up in. Same porch swing creaking softly in the evening wind. The walls inside remained frozen in time. Framed school photos, volleyball trophies, faded graduation announcements Emily never lived to see fulfilled. Karen listened without interrupting. The moment Ortega mentioned Grady's name, something changed in her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. He always watched her, she said quietly. Ortega paused. Karen explained that Grady used to linger near the fence whenever Emily played outside as a teenager. Nothing overt enough to report. Nothing criminal. Just lingering stares. Uncomfortable conversations. Once he offered to fix Emily's truck for free, even though nothing was broken. Back then Karen dismissed it as harmless awkwardness. Now her hands trembled while speaking. You think he took her? It wasn't a question. Ortega didn't answer directly because investigators still lacked proof. Suspicion wasn't enough. After nearly 3 decades, they needed something undeniable. DNA. Fibers. A confession. Anything. and obtaining it would be difficult because much of the original evidence had degraded over time. Biological samples collected in 1998 were limited. Chain of custody procedures from small-town departments back then weren't always perfect. Defense attorneys destroyed cases over tiny mistakes. Still, Ortega believed they had one advantage nobody possessed in 1998: modern forensic genealogy. The same technology that exposed the Golden State Killer. The same science turning forgotten cold cases into national headlines. Investigators resubmitted evidence from Emily's truck for advanced testing. Tiny particles overlooked decades earlier were extracted from beneath the passenger seat and steering column. Forensic analysts searched for touch DNA invisible to investigators in the 90s. Days stretched into weeks. Then the lab called. A partial male DNA profile had been recovered from the broken silver bracelet found inside Emily's truck. Not enough for Cody's, but enough for genealogy comparison. Suddenly the case accelerated with terrifying speed. Genealogists built family trees from distant relatives connected through public databases. Third cousins, fourth cousins, shared bloodlines branching backward through generations across Texas and Oklahoma. Investigators narrowed possibilities slowly, methodically, until one family name surfaced repeatedly near Ash Creek: Grady. Even then, Ortega remained cautious. Partial DNA could support a theory, not prove murder. They needed direct comparison evidence tied specifically to Thomas Grady. So surveillance began. Unmarked vehicles parked near his home. Investigators tracked routines. Grady, now 69 years old, lived alone in a weathered trailer outside town, surrounded by rusted machinery and overgrown weeds. Neighbors described him as bitter, isolated, paranoid. He rarely attended community events anymore. But he watched people constantly. One deputy noted that Grady seemed especially nervous whenever police vehicles passed nearby. He stared like he knew, the deputy later wrote. Investigators collected discarded items secretly. Coffee cups, beer cans, cigarette butts. The process felt surreal. 27 years after Emily vanished, detectives were digging through trash hoping to solve the case that haunted an entire generation. Then came the match. Thomas Grady's DNA aligned with the partial profile recovered from Emily's bracelet. Not conclusive enough alone for murder charges, but enough for probable cause. Enough to reopen every buried suspicion from 1998. Enough to make seasoned detectives feel sick to their stomachs. Because if Grady touched that bracelet inside Emily's truck the night she vanished, his original statement was a lie. And liars inside murder investigations rarely lie by accident. The task force prepared carefully before bringing him in. Ortega knew old suspects often cracked under pressure once confronted with modern evidence, especially those who spent decades believing they escaped. The interview took place on March 3, 2025. Room 2, Ash Creek Sheriff's Office. Gray walls, metal table, one camera recording. Thomas Grady entered wearing a faded camouflage jacket despite the heat outside. His hair had turned thin and white with age, but his eyes remained sharp, alert, measuring everything. At first he acted calm, almost amused. "You boys still chasing ghost stories?" he asked. Ortega slid the surveillance still across the table. Blue pickup beside the gas station. Grady's smile weakened slightly. That could be anybody. Then came the DNA results. For the first time, silence filled the room. Grady leaned back slowly, jaw tightening. "You got nothing," he muttered. But Ortega noticed something critical. Sweat forming along the neckline despite the cold air conditioning. The interview lasted 4 hours. Grady denied everything. Denied knowing Emily well. Denied being near her truck. Denied touching the bracelet. Then his story shifted again. Maybe he helped her with engine trouble weeks earlier. Maybe that explained the DNA. Maybe investigators were twisting evidence. Every answer created new contradictions. And with every contradiction, Ortega pushed harder. Finally, he asked the question haunting Ash Creek for 27 years. "Where is Emily Harper?" Grady looked down at the table. 10 seconds passed. 15. Then he smiled. Not nervous. Not frightened. Smiled. "You'll never find her." The room went dead silent. Experienced interrogators recognized the danger instantly. That sentence wasn't denial. It wasn't confusion. It carried ownership. Control. A quiet pleasure hidden beneath the words. Ortega kept his voice steady. What happened that night? Grady's eyes drifted toward the camera, then back to Ortega. She shouldn't have stopped. Investigators later described that moment as the point where the case transformed from suspicion into horror. Because for 27 years the town imagined monsters hiding in forests or passing through highways. Instead, the nightmare had likely been living 3 houses away. The interview ended without confession, but prosecutors believed they finally had enough to move forward. Circumstantial evidence, DNA, false statements, vehicle match, behavioral indicators. A grand jury agreed. On April 18, 2025, Thomas Grady was arrested for the murder of Emily Harper. The headline detonated across Texas before sunrise. Texas teen cold case cracked after 27 years, neighbor arrested. Ash Creek erupted. Reporters flooded the town again, exactly like 1998. Satellite trucks lined courthouse streets. Former residents returned just to witness history unfolding. Social media exploded with side-by-side images of Emily's smiling school portrait and Grady's booking photo. People who once defended him deleted old comments overnight. Others admitted they always suspected him. Some blamed the original investigation. Some blamed themselves. Karen Harper said almost nothing publicly after the arrest. Cameras captured her leaving the courthouse wearing dark sunglasses, shoulders trembling while reporters shouted questions from every direction. Do you believe this is finally over? Did you ever suspect Thomas Grady? What would you say to him today? She never answered, because the truth was more complicated. The arrest solved one mystery, but another remained untouched. Where was Emily? Without a body, prosecutors faced enormous challenges. Defense attorneys attacked every weakness immediately. The DNA was partial, the evidence old, memories unreliable after nearly 3 decades. And most terrifying of all, Thomas Grady still refused to say where she was. Search warrants executed on his property uncovered disturbing discoveries. Burned barrels containing traces of old fabric. Rusted jewelry fragments. A hidden crawl space beneath a storage shed. Cadaver dogs alerted near a dried-out well behind the trailer. Investigators dug for days. Nothing. No remains. No definitive crime scene. Just fragments of suspicion layered over years of silence. Then another witness emerged. A retired truck driver named Raymond Pike contacted investigators after seeing the arrest on television. His hands reportedly shook during the phone call. Because he remembered something he never told police in 1998. 2 nights after Emily vanished, Pike claimed he saw Thomas Grady parked near Blackwater Creek after midnight. Not alone. Standing beside a large rolled tarp in the bed of his truck. And under the harsh glow of highway lights, Pike noticed what looked like mud smeared dark across Grady's boots. Or maybe blood. For 27 years, he convinced himself it meant nothing. Now he wasn't so sure anymore. The night after the arrest, Ash Creek didn't sleep. Not really. Even with Thomas Grady in custody, even with patrol cars circling slower than usual, even with reporters finally pushed back behind barricades, the town felt like it was still standing at the edge of something unfinished. Windows stayed lit longer than normal. Porch lights weren't turned off. People who hadn't spoken in years suddenly found excuses to check on neighbors. Because everyone understood the same unsettling truth. An arrest was not an ending. Not without Emily Harper. Inside the interrogation wing, Grady sat in the same room, unchanged in posture, but something about him had shifted. The calm amusement from earlier was gone. What replaced it wasn't panic. It was calculation. The quiet focus of someone running through outcomes no one else could see. Detective Ortega noticed it immediately. Grady wasn't breaking. He was waiting. The interview resumed at dawn. Different tone now. Less patience. More pressure. Prosecutors had approved extended questioning. Every detail from the past 27 years laid out on the table like exposed wiring. The DNA match. The witness revisited. The gas station truck. The inconsistencies in his statements. Ortega leaned forward. You were there that night, Thomas. We can place your vehicle within minutes of her last confirmed sighting. We have your DNA inside her truck. We have multiple witnesses placing you near search routes. This doesn't go away. Grady exhaled slowly, then said something unexpected. You're asking the wrong question. The room went still. Ortega didn't respond immediately. Experienced interrogators recognized deflection when they heard it, but this felt different. Not denial. Not evasion. something almost directional. Ortega narrowed his eyes. What question should I be asking? Grady looked up for the first time since dawn. Ask yourself why she stopped. Silence pressed into the walls. That detail had haunted the case since 1998. Why did Emily Harper stop between the gas station and home? Why did she leave a perfectly safe route? Why did she pull over onto a road she had no reason to be on? Investigators had theories. Mechanical issue. Familiar voice. Someone she trusted. But none were confirmed. Grady's lips tightened slightly, like he was deciding how much to reveal without giving anything away. She wasn't forced off the road, he said quietly. Ortega felt the temperature in the room drop. That's your story? Grady didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back again, eyes drifting to the ceiling like he was remembering something distant. The expression unsettled every investigator present, because it didn't match guilt or innocence. It matched familiarity. As if the night wasn't lost to him at all. As if he had carried it uninterrupted for 27 years. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation building, search teams expanded operations for the first time in decades. The arrest had unlocked legal authority to revisit sealed areas of Ash Creek County land, including private property previously denied under lack of probable cause. Grady's trailer was the first target. What they found there didn't solve the case, but it changed its shape. Beneath rotting floorboards in a detached shed, investigators uncovered a hidden compartment sealed with rusted metal panels. Inside were objects carefully wrapped in plastic bags that had long since degraded. A broken flip phone from the early 2000s, a rusted keychain shaped like a volleyball, and a stack of photographs. Not crime scene photos. Personal ones. Emily Harper at different ages. School events. Diner shifts. A volleyball match taken from the stands. None of them were public images. These were candid shots. Some taken from distance. Some through windows. Some clearly zoomed in from hiding. The implication hit investigators like a physical force. This wasn't just a single encounter. This was surveillance. Years of it. Ortega stood over the evidence table as photos were cataloged. One detective whispered. He was watching her before she disappeared. The realization changed everything. Because it meant the timeline didn't begin on the night Emily vanished. It began long before anyone noticed. Inside the interrogation room, Ortega returned with the photos. He placed them down without speaking. Grady glanced at them once. Just once. And looked away. That reaction alone confirmed what investigators feared most. Familiarity. Ownership. Not confusion. Not surprise. Recognition. Ortega pressed harder. How long had you been watching her? Grady's jaw tightened. For the first time, irritation broke through his calm. I didn't take her. It was the first direct denial in hours. But it was weaker than before. Because it came too late. And because the evidence outside the room was no longer theoretical. By midday, forensic teams escalated their search near Blackwater Creek. The same location the truck driver Raymond Pike had reported seeing Grady near in 1998. Cadaver dogs were deployed again across dried riverbeds and collapsed soil near an abandoned irrigation trench. At 3:17 p.m., one of the dogs stopped. Completely. No barking. No movement. Just rigid focus toward a section of ground partially concealed by brush and erosion. Excavation began immediately. The soil was compacted, layered with sediment buildup that suggested disturbance years earlier. Shovels gave way to controlled digging. Then mechanical assistance. Then careful hand excavation when something irregular appeared beneath the surface. Fabric. Degraded. Fused into the earth. Then bone fragments. Small. Inconsistent. Not enough for immediate identification. But enough to stop the entire operation in silence. Word reached Ortega within minutes. He didn't speak for nearly half a minute after hearing it. Because discovery changed the trajectory of every cold case. Even partial remains meant the story was no longer theoretical. It was physical. And physical evidence did not forget. Inside the interrogation room, Grady noticed the shift before anyone told him. He saw it in Ortega's posture when he re-entered. Something heavier. Something irreversible. What did you find? Grady asked. Ortega didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a single photograph on the table. It showed the excavation site. Grady stared at it. Just like before. No reaction at first. Then, slowly, something subtle shifted in his expression. Not shock. Not fear. A tightening around the eyes. Like recognition he hadn't planned to reveal. Ortega watched closely. Those remains are being tested, he said. If they match Emily Harper, this stops being a missing persons case. It becomes murder with physical recovery. That changes your entire legal position. Grady finally spoke, quieter now. You're not going to find her whole. The room froze again. Even the recording officer looked up. Ortega leaned forward sharply. What does that mean? Grady exhaled through his nose. Not laughter. Not anger. Something tired. I told you. She shouldn't have stopped. The words landed differently this time. He wasn't denying involvement. He was framing inevitability. As if the outcome had been decided in his mind long before investigators arrived. Outside, Ash Creek began to fracture under the weight of the discovery. News spread quickly despite attempts at controlled release. Reporters speculated wildly. Social media exploded with theories. Some called it closure beginning. Others called it confirmation of something far darker. Karen Harper remained at home. When Ortega visited her again that evening, she didn't ask for details. She simply said, "You found something." Ortega nodded. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. Is it her? He hesitated. We're waiting on confirmation. That was enough. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing something she had been bracing for decades. Then she asked the question investigators dreaded most. Why won't he tell you where all of her is? Ortega had no immediate answer. Because that question had begun haunting him too. Back at the station, forensic genealogy teams worked through the night on the recovered bone fragments. Early indicators suggested they were human, but degraded beyond easy identification. DNA extraction would take time, possibly weeks. But there was something else. Buried with the remains was a second object. A thin metal charm, corroded but still intact enough to recognize its shape. A small engraved letter. E. The same initial Emily Harper's family had confirmed was on a bracelet she always wore. The same bracelet that broke inside her truck 27 years earlier. The same bracelet that had already given investigators their first DNA breakthrough. And now, possibly, their final confirmation. Inside the interrogation room, Grady remained silent for the longest stretch yet. No jokes. No deflection. Just stillness. Ortega studied him carefully. For the first time, he noticed something else. Not confidence. Not defiance. Distance. As if Grady wasn't sitting in the present anymore. As if part of him had already returned to that night in 1998 and never left. And somewhere outside the walls of Ash Creek Sheriff's Office, beneath Texas soil that had held its secrets for nearly 3 decades, the last physical traces of Emily Harper were finally beginning to surface into the light. The confirmation didn't arrive like justice usually does in stories people expect. There was no dramatic phone call, no celebratory announcement, no sudden relief that washed over the room. Instead, it came quietly. A lab report uploaded into a secured system at 2:41 a.m. Then verified again. And only after that did anyone dare to speak it aloud. The remains recovered near Blackwater Creek matched Emily Harper. Not partially. Not uncertainly. Statistically, scientifically, undeniably matched. After 27 years of questions, rumors, and collapsing theories, the case finally had something it had never truly possessed before. Proof of death. Inside Ash Creek Sheriff's Office, the news didn't spark celebration. It didn't bring closure. It settled over the building like a weight no one could lift. Detective Ortega read the report twice without blinking. The words didn't change. The meaning didn't soften. Emily Harper had been found, or at least what remained of her had surfaced from the ground that had kept her hidden for nearly 3 decades. And still, something felt unfinished. Because confirmation of remains was not the same as understanding what happened. Ortega looked across the table at Thomas Grady. Grady had already been told. Or at least, he had heard enough from the silence in the hallway, the shift in footsteps, the change in tone between officers entering and leaving the room. He sat still, hands resting flat, face unreadable in a way that no longer felt like control but something deeper, almost detached. You knew, Ortega said finally. It wasn't a question anymore. Grady didn't respond immediately. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the building, soft enough to almost disguise the tension inside the room. When Grady finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. I told you she shouldn't have stopped. Ortega exhaled slowly, forcing patience down. That's not an answer. Grady tilted his head slightly. It is to me. The words landed heavier than anything he had said before. Not because they revealed guilt outright, but because they implied something far more unsettling. A version of events that had been settled in his mind long before anyone else started asking questions. Ortega leaned forward. Then tell us what happened. For the first time since his arrest, Grady hesitated in a way that felt different. Not deflective. Not strategic. It looked almost like restraint, as if speaking further required crossing a line he hadn't decided to cross yet. Outside the interrogation room, the building was moving faster now. Evidence teams processed the excavation findings. Forensic anthropologists carefully documented every fragment recovered from Blackwater Creek. Search perimeters expanded based on new calculations of soil displacement and historical mapping of rural access roads. Then came the second discovery. Half a mile upstream, another alert from cadaver dogs. A second site. Smaller. More disturbed. And this time, the ground yielded something different. Personal items. A wristwatch. A fragment of fabric consistent with a school uniform. And a second piece of jewelry that sent a shock through every investigator present. A charm bracelet. Not broken. Not buried in fragments. Intact enough to read. Engraved letters forming a name, Emily. The discovery shifted the entire case again. Because now investigators faced a possibility no one wanted to fully articulate. There may have been more than one location tied to what happened that night. Multiple sites. Multiple stages. A sequence rather than a single event. Inside the interrogation room, Ortega returned with the new evidence. He placed the items on the table without speaking at first. Grady's eyes dropped to them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, almost under his breath, she moved more than once. Ortega froze. Who moved her? Grady didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned back slightly, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room, beyond the present moment entirely. You don't understand how fast things happen when you're not prepared. The statement didn't clarify anything. Instead, it expanded the mystery. Because nothing in the original investigation suggested movement after the initial disappearance. Everything pointed to a single event, a single moment where Emily vanished from the road. But now the ground itself suggested otherwise. Ortega pressed harder. You're saying she wasn't taken just once. Grady's jaw tightened slightly. I'm saying she didn't stay where you think she did. That was as close to an admission as they had ever gotten. Outside, reporters were already speculating. Even without official confirmation, leaks had begun to spread. Social media accounts were dissecting every fragment of information like puzzle pieces from a story they believed they were finally close to solving. But inside the interrogation room, the tone was still something else entirely. Not resolution. Not clarity. Something more fractured. Ortega changed tactics. He slid a new photograph across the table. The second excavation site. The charm bracelet. Emily's name still partially visible despite corrosion. This was found separate from the first location, he said, which means either she was moved or someone placed personal items deliberately to mislead investigators. Which is it? Grady looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the silence became uncomfortable. Then he said something unexpected. I didn't want it to go that far. The room shifted instantly. Even the recording officer stopped moving. Ortega didn't interrupt. Grady continued, voice quieter now. She was supposed to leave. That was the plan. It wasn't supposed to become what it became. Ortega's pulse tightened. You're admitting involvement. Grady didn't correct him. He didn't deny it either. Instead, he stared at the table like it held something only he could see. She shouldn't have stopped, he repeated again, but this time it sounded less like a justification and more like repetition of something rehearsed in memory for decades. Ortega felt something cold settle in his chest. Tell me what that means. Grady finally looked up, and for the first time since the interrogation began, there was something close to fatigue in his expression. Not exhaustion from questioning, but something older, heavily carried. She knew me, he said. That changed everything. Ortega straightened slightly. Explain. Grady hesitated again, then continued. She wasn't random. The implication hit harder than anything before it, because it aligned with what investigators had slowly begun to suspect, but never fully proven. Emily Harper hadn't encountered a stranger on that road. She had encountered someone familiar enough for hesitation, for trust, for stopping. Ortega's voice sharpened. How did she know you? Grady didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly. She saw me before. The room went still again. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance, echoing through the building like something approaching. Ortega leaned forward. When? Grady finally spoke. Long before that night. And with those words, the timeline fractured. Because suddenly the investigation was no longer anchored in a single evening in 1998. It stretched backward. It pulled into years no one had previously considered relevant. It turned routine background checks into something far more disturbing. If Emily had seen him before, then the connection wasn't incidental. It was established, reinforced, possibly escalating long before her disappearance. Ortega felt the case shift beneath him. You were following her, he said. Grady's expression tightened. I was near her, he corrected softly. But even that distinction no longer mattered. Because investigators now had a pattern emerging across recovered photographs, witness statements, and newly analyzed timelines. Occasional sightings, unexplained proximity, vehicles appearing near locations where Emily had been. Not once, repeatedly, over time, slow accumulation of presence. Ortega stood slightly now. You weren't just at the gas station that night, were you? Grady didn't respond. That silence was enough. Inside the building, everything seemed to compress at once. The case was no longer a mystery of disappearance. It was becoming something far more structured, more deliberate in hindsight. A timeline that stretched further than anyone had originally believed. Then Ortega asked the question that had been forming since the excavation began. Where is the rest of her? Grady looked up, and for the first time since his arrest, something shifted fully in his expression. Not defiance, not control, something closer to inevitability. You already found her, he said. Ortega's voice dropped. No, we didn't. Grady blinked slowly, then said something that made the entire room feel colder. Not all of her needed to be in one place. The statement hung there, unresolved. Not a confession, not a denial. Something worse. A fragmented truth that refused to settle into anything complete. Outside, Ash Creek was beginning to understand that the arrest hadn't closed anything at all. It had only opened doors that had been locked for 27 years. And behind those doors, investigators were now realizing the answers they were uncovering might not come together neatly in the way everyone had hoped. Because some cases don't resolve. They unravel. The phrase lingered in the interrogation room long after Thomas Grady stopped speaking. Not all of her needed to be in one place. It wasn't just disturbing. It was structurally wrong in the way experienced detectives immediately recognize, like a piece of a puzzle that doesn't belong to the same box. Ortega had spent years listening to suspects shape lies, but this wasn't a lie in the usual sense. Lies try to hide truth. This felt like a rearrangement of it. Outside the room, Ash Creek had already begun to fracture into competing versions of reality. One version was simple, a long-awaited arrest, a cold case finally breaking open, justice slowly crawling toward resolution after 27 years of silence. The other version was darker, less stable, built from fragments of evidence that refused to align cleanly. Inside that second version, Emily Harper was no longer just missing. She had been managed, handled, moved, contained in ways investigators were only now beginning to map. Ortega stepped out briefly to review the expanded excavation report. The second site near Blackwater Creek had revealed more than initially disclosed. Soil layering suggested disturbance at two distinct periods separated by years, not a single deposition event. That meant something crucial. Whatever happened to Emily Harper did not end in 1998. It echoed forward. A forensic anthropologist pointed to the stratigraphy images. See here, she said quietly. This layer is older, but the disturbance above it is at least 5 to 7 years later. Someone returned. That sentence changed the emotional weight of the entire investigation. Returned. Not once. Possibly more. Back in the interrogation room, Grady sat in silence while investigators recalibrated their understanding of everything they thought they knew. Ortega returned with that information still fresh in his mind. You went back, Ortega said. Grady didn't react immediately. The question wasn't whether something had happened. It was when and how often. Grady finally spoke. I didn't have to go back. That answer created immediate tension in the room because it avoided the core implication while still acknowledging proximity. Ortega leaned forward. Then who did? Grady's eyes shifted slightly, not toward Ortega, but toward the wall behind him, as if visualizing something beyond the room. You think it ends where you found her, he said quietly. But it didn't end there. The statement was vague, but in investigative terms it pointed toward fragmentation of the case timeline. Multiple events instead of one. Possible secondary involvement, or post-event activity that had never been detected. Ortega's patience thinned. Stop speaking in circles. Grady looked back at him. I'm not. Outside, analysts were already re-examining old evidence logs. One detail from 1998 resurfaced with new relevance. A maintenance worker had once reported seeing tire tracks near an abandoned service road 3 days after Emily's disappearance. At the time, it was dismissed as irrelevant due to lack of physical evidence. Now, it aligned uncomfortably with the idea of repeated site access. Then came another development. A retired volunteer search coordinator from the original 1998 effort contacted the sheriff's office after seeing Grady's arrest on television. Her statement was hesitant, fragmented by time and memory, but one detail stood out sharply enough to be logged immediately. She remembered seeing a blue pickup truck parked near the outer perimeter of the search zone 2 separate times during the first week of the investigation. Same truck description, same damaged bumper, same quiet presence. But what she remembered most wasn't the truck itself. It was the driver watching the volunteers. Not participating, not helping, watching. That detail, added to everything else, created a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. Thomas Grady hadn't just been near Emily Harper before she disappeared. He had been near the response to her disappearance. Ortega returned to the interrogation room with a new file. He placed it down without speaking first. Grady looked at it, but didn't open it. You were there after she vanished, Ortega said. Grady didn't deny it. That silence carried more weight than any statement he had made so far. Ortega continued. You weren't just involved in the night she disappeared. You were around the search, the investigation, the recovery efforts. That's not coincidence. That's proximity over time. Grady's expression tightened slightly. People see what they want to see, he said. Ortega shook his head. This isn't perception. This is placement. For the first time since the interrogation began, Grady shifted in his seat. Not dramatically, just enough to signal discomfort breaking through the surface. But instead of answering directly, he changed direction again. She talked to me once, he said. That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. Ortega's voice lowered. When? Grady hesitated. At the diner. Ortega felt the timeline snap into sharper focus. Emily worked at a diner off Route 18. That was confirmed in early interviews. But no record had ever indicated interaction with Grady there. You spoke to her, Ortega said carefully. Grady nodded slightly. Briefly. About what? Grady looked down. Nothing important. But investigators knew better than to accept that phrase at face value. In cases like this, nothing important often marked the exact moment everything began. Ortega pressed. You were known to her before the night she vanished. Grady didn't correct him. Instead, he said something quieter. She didn't think anything of it. That sentence introduced a new layer of complexity. It suggested asymmetry in awareness. One person recognizing a connection while the other remained unaware or dismissive. In investigative profiling, that often precedes escalation in cases involving obsession or fixation patterns. Ortega stepped closer. Did she know you were watching her? Grady's jaw tightened. I wasn't watching her. But the denial came too late again, softened by everything already uncovered. Outside, the excavation teams reached another anomaly at Blackwater Creek. Beneath an older sediment layer, they found evidence of a disturbed depression in soil consistent with a shallow excavation that had been refilled. The edges were irregular, suggesting manual digging rather than environmental collapse. Nearby, fragments of plastic sheeting were recovered, degraded but still identifiable through forensic microscopy. The implication was immediate. This site had been modified after initial deposition. Someone had returned. Someone had changed it. Ortega was notified mid-interrogation. He didn't interrupt Grady immediately. Instead, he absorbed the information, letting it settle before responding. Then he placed it on the table. They found evidence of redisturbance, Ortega said. Someone went back to the site. Grady looked at him for a long moment, then spoke softly. You're finally asking the right question. Ortega's tone sharpened. Which is? Grady leaned forward slightly. Not what happened that night. A pause. But what didn't end that night? The silence that followed wasn't comfortable anymore. It felt structural, like something large had been revealed beneath the surface, but not yet fully exposed. Ortega felt the investigation shifting again, but this time in a way that was harder to control. Because every new discovery wasn't closing gaps. It was expanding them, expanding timelines, expanding involvement, expanding the possibility that Emily Harper's disappearance was not a single moment in time, but a sequence that extended beyond anything originally recorded. And somewhere in that sequence, Thomas Grady was no longer just a suspect in a disappearance. He was becoming something else entirely in the investigation's evolving structure. Not just a person of interest, but a recurring presence across years of unanswered questions. Inside the room, Grady finally leaned back again, expression settling into something unreadable once more. But this time, Ortega noticed something different. Grady wasn't trying to hide anymore. He was waiting for the investigators to catch up to a version of the story they still didn't fully understand. And outside, under the weight of reopened soil and rewritten timelines, Ash Creek began to realize that the cold case everyone thought had been cracked was actually only beginning to reveal how deep it went. The storm hit Ash Creek just before midnight, but by then, nobody in the sheriff's office was paying attention to weather anymore. Lightning split the sky in sharp white fractures, briefly illuminating the parking lot where unmarked vehicles came and went like nervous thoughts that couldn't settle. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over stacks of reopened files, excavation reports, and photographs that no longer felt like history. They felt like exposure. Detective Ortega stood alone in the evidence room for a long time, staring at the recovered items laid out in careful rows. Emily Harper's name was on reports again, spoken aloud again, printed again in fresh ink like the past had refused to stay buried. But what unsettled him most wasn't what had been found. It was what still didn't fit. 2 excavation sites. 2 different layers of disturbance. Recovered items suggesting movement across years, not hours. And Thomas Grady's voice repeating the same phrase like a loop that refused to break. She shouldn't have stopped. Ortega replayed the interrogation in his mind as he walked back toward the holding area. Every sentence Grady gave wasn't building a confession. It was constructing something else entirely. A framework. A version of events that didn't behave like a standard crime narrative. It behaved like a sequence with missing segments. Inside the interrogation room, Grady was no longer speaking. He sat with his head slightly tilted, eyes unfocused, as if the conversation had already moved somewhere else for him. Not asleep. Not alert. Somewhere suspended in between. Ortega entered without announcing himself. Grady didn't react. The silence stretched for several seconds before Ortega finally spoke. You keep saying she stopped. At the gas station, on the road, at the wrong moment. Why does that matter so much to you? Grady blinked slowly, like the question had taken time to reach him. Because it changed everything, he said. Ortega stepped closer. How? Grady's gaze shifted upward, not meeting Ortega's eyes directly. It wasn't supposed to happen there. The answer didn't clarify. It reframed. Ortega felt it immediately. That subtle but dangerous shift where a suspect stops resisting and starts describing internal logic instead of external facts. It's often the point where investigators realize they are no longer hearing denial or confession. They are hearing worldview. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain struck the building in uneven bursts, as if the weather itself couldn't decide how hard to hit the town. Ortega pressed forward. What wasn't supposed to happen? Grady hesitated. Then, quietly. Her stopping. That single phrase again. Not new information, but repeated structure. A fixed point in his account that everything else seemed to orbit. Ortega studied him carefully. You're not talking about an accident anymore, he said. You're talking about intent. Grady didn't correct him. Instead, he said something that made Ortega pause. I'm talking about timing. That word lingered. Timing. It implied coordination. Sequence. Expectations. Not random encounter, but alignment of events. Ortega narrowed his eyes. Whose timing? Grady didn't answer immediately. And when he finally did, his voice lowered. Not mine. A beat of silence. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. In the evidence room, analysts were now reviewing something that had been overlooked in earlier decades. Archived phone records from the Harper household. Not calls placed after Emily disappeared, but calls made days before. One entry stood out. A short, unanswered call originating from a payphone near Route 18. Time stamped 9:12 p.m. 2 nights before Emily vanished. The call lasted less than 10 seconds. No conversation recorded. But the location was enough. Close enough to her work route. Close enough to her routine. Close enough to matter. Ortega was notified again. This time, he didn't leave the interrogation room. He read the report standing still. Then looked back at Grady. "You called her," Ortega said. Grady frowned slightly. "No." Ortega held up the document. A payphone near Route 18. 2 nights before she disappeared. Grady stared at it for a moment, then shook his head slowly. "That wasn't me." The response was immediate, but something in his tone changed. Less control. More insistence. A subtle break in the pattern. Ortega noticed. "You're saying someone else was near her before she vanished." Grady's eyes tightened. "I'm saying she was already part of something before that night." The words hit differently now because they implied pre-existing context. Not coincidence. Not random intersection. Something established before the disappearance. Ortega stepped forward. "Explain." Grady exhaled slowly. "She noticed patterns," he said. That statement changed the atmosphere again, because it introduced agency on Emily's side. Awareness. Observation. It implied she was not just a passive victim in a single moment, but someone potentially interacting with a situation unfolding over time. Ortega leaned in. "What patterns?" Grady hesitated again. Then carefully. "Same vehicle. Same places. Same distance." Ortega felt the weight of the implication forming. "You were following her." Grady's response was immediate. "I wasn't following her." But this time, Ortega didn't let the denial settle. "Then explain why your truck appears near her routes multiple times in the weeks before she disappeared." Grady looked at him. And for the first time since the interrogation began, something like frustration broke through. "I wasn't the only one who drove those roads." That sentence introduced something new into the case structure. Possibility of overlap. Multiple actors. Or at least multiple presences within the same spatial pattern. Ortega stepped back slightly. "You're suggesting someone else was involved." Grady didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "You think it starts with me because that's where you found me." Outside, the storm reached its peak. Power flickered briefly in the building, causing monitors to dim and hum back to life. And in that flicker of instability, Ortega realized something uncomfortable. Every time Grady spoke, the case expanded instead of narrowing. Not toward clarity, toward layers. At the same time, search teams working under floodlights near Blackwater Creek made another discovery. This time not in soil, but in erosion exposed by rainfall. A section of ground had collapsed overnight, revealing a deeper cavity beneath previously searched terrain. Inside it, investigators found something unexpected. Not remains, not clothing, but markings. Scratches in the soil walls. Linear patterns that suggested repeated contact with tools or movement over time. Some markings appeared fresh compared to others, indicating disturbance at different intervals. It suggested activity over years. Not a single event. Ortega was called again, but he stayed in the room. When the report was relayed to him, he didn't react immediately. He simply looked at Grady. "You said it didn't end that night," Ortega said. Grady nodded slightly. "And you were right," Ortega continued, "because it didn't start there either." A long silence followed. Then Grady spoke, quieter than before. "She changed things when she stopped." Ortega's voice sharpened. "Stop saying that. Explain it." Grady looked at him directly now. And for the first time, his expression wasn't guarded. It was fixed. "Because once she stopped," he said, "everything that came after had to adjust." That sentence didn't explain the crime, but it reframed its structure entirely. Not a single act, not a single moment, but something adaptive, reactive, something that continued responding long after the initial event. Ortega felt it then, the slow realization forming in his mind that this case might not be a straight line from disappearance to discovery. It might be a system that had been operating in fragments for decades, with Emily Harper at its center, not just as a victim, but as the point everything else orbited around. And Thomas Grady, whether fully responsible or not, was not speaking like someone recalling a moment. He was speaking like someone describing a structure that had continued long after it began. Outside, the storm finally began to break. But inside the sheriff's office, nothing was settling. Because every new piece of evidence wasn't closing the distance to truth. It was revealing how far that distance had always been. By morning, Ash Creek looked like a town that had aged 10 years overnight. Rainwater still clung to the streets in thin reflective sheets, mirroring the courthouse, the sheriff's office, and the clusters of reporters who never truly left anymore. The story had stopped being local a long time ago. Now it was national property again, reborn from the ground, reshaped by DNA, and dragging every unanswered version of Emily Harper back into the light. Inside the sheriff's office, the interrogation room had not changed, but the energy inside it had. Detective Ortega hadn't slept. No one really had. Across the table, Thomas Grady sat in the same position he had held through most of the night, but something subtle had shifted in his presence. Not weakness, not confession, something more unsettling, acceptance, as if the structure of the situation no longer required his resistance. The case file between them was thicker now. Not metaphorically. Physically thicker. Pages added overnight. Reports printed at dawn. Excavation summaries, lab confirmations, supplemental witness statements pulled from forgotten archives, all stacked together like a growing weight that refused to stay contained. Ortega flipped it open. "This isn't narrowing," he said. "It's expanding." Grady looked at him without reacting. "That's because you're only seeing one line," he replied. Ortega's eyes narrowed slightly. "There isn't another line." That was when Grady smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in something closer to resignation. "There always is," he said. Outside the room, analysts were still working through soil recovery data from Blackwater Creek. The second excavation site had revealed deeper anomalies overnight after the storm shifted terrain. Ground collapse exposed additional layers that hadn't been visible during initial searches. And in those layers, something even more troubling had emerged. A second disturbance zone, older than the first, and positioned in a way that suggested deliberate spacing between events, not randomness. A forensic geologist summarized it simply in her report. "This site shows evidence of repeated revisitation over extended years." That sentence alone changed the emotional temperature of the entire investigation. Repeated revisitation. Not once, not twice, but over time. Ortega read it once, then again, as if repetition might soften its meaning. It didn't. He returned to the interrogation room carrying the report like it weighed more than paper should. Grady watched him approach. "You went back," Ortega said as soon as he sat down. Grady didn't deny it this time. That silence confirmed more than words could. Ortega slid the report across the table. Multiple disturbances. Different time periods. That means someone returned to the same locations years apart. Grady's gaze dropped to the page, but his expression remained unchanged. Ortega continued. "That doesn't look like panic. That looks like maintenance." A flicker passed across Grady's face at that word. Maintenance. As if it landed closer to truth than anything else so far. But he still didn't speak. Ortega leaned forward. "Why go back?" Grady exhaled slowly. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter than before. "Because things don't stay the same." That answer wasn't a confession. It was a philosophy. Ortega felt frustration rise. "Stop speaking in riddles. We have your DNA. We have your vehicle near her last known location. We have remains tied to her identity. You are not in a position to turn this into metaphor." For the first time, Grady's calm expression tightened slightly. "It's not metaphor," he said. A pause. "It's sequence." That word again. Sequence. Ortega felt the case shift under him once more. He had interrogated violent offenders before. Some confessed immediately. Some resisted until evidence overwhelmed them. Others fractured under pressure, their narratives collapsing into incoherence. But Grady wasn't doing any of those things. He was constructing continuity. Outside, the FBI liaison assigned to the case arrived with updated forensic genealogy results. What had once been a partial DNA profile was now being reanalyzed using newer sequencing techniques. Early indicators suggested the sample recovered from Emily's bracelet may have contained mixed traces, not just one contributor. That detail was enough to bring Ortega out of the room briefly. When he returned, his expression had changed. He placed the updated report down. "We may have more than one contributor," he said. Grady didn't react immediately, but something in his posture shifted slightly. Ortega noticed. "You knew that," Ortega said. Grady's eyes lifted slowly. "I told you," he said. "It wasn't just one moment." Ortega felt something cold settle in. "Are you saying there was someone else with you?" Grady didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "You keep trying to isolate it." That statement hit differently than the others, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't evasive. It was observational, as if he was describing how investigators were approaching a system they hadn't fully understood yet. Ortega stood slightly. "If there was someone else involved, you need to say it now." Grady looked at him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You already know there are gaps you can't fill." The room went quiet again. Outside, Ash Creek was beginning to divide into competing narratives. One narrative centered on Thomas Grady as sole perpetrator. Another was forming in fragments, suggesting broader involvement, possible misinterpretation of evidence, or a scenario that extended beyond a single individual's control. Neither version was comforting, and neither was complete. Back in the field, search teams returned to a third location flagged by geographic correlation models. This one had not been previously excavated in 1998 or during recent operations. It was identified through subtle terrain pattern analysis, suggesting unnatural soil consistency changes across decades. At the site, investigators uncovered something unexpected beneath surface erosion. Not remains, not clothing, but a sealed metal container. Inside were fragments of paper, water-damaged but partially preserved. Handwritten notes, dates, short phrases, and repeated references to distances. Road markers, time gaps, observations. Not a diary, not evidence logs. Something more fragmented, like attempts to map movement over time. When Ortega was informed, he paused mid-question in the interrogation room. Grady noticed immediately. "You found something else," he said. Ortega didn't respond at first. Then, "Notes." Grady nodded slightly. "Then you're starting to see it." Ortega's voice sharpened. "See what?" Grady looked at him steadily. "That it didn't happen in one place." A long silence followed. The weight of the words settled differently now because they were no longer abstract. They were aligning with physical evidence across multiple sites, multiple disturbances, multiple recoveries that refused to converge into a single point. Ortega felt the structure of the case bending. Not collapsing. Expanding. "You're not giving me a confession," Ortega said. "You're giving me a map." Grady didn't deny it. That was the moment Ortega realized something critical. Grady wasn't resisting resolution. He was resisting simplification. And outside, under gray skies that refused to fully clear, Ash Creek began to understand that what had been called a cold case for 27 years was never a single event waiting to be solved. It was something that had been unfolding in fragments all along. And only now, piece by piece, was it beginning to show its full shape. The sealed metal container arrived at the lab just after noon, still caked in dirt that had survived decades underground. No one touched it more than necessary. Even the technicians handling it seemed aware they weren't just processing evidence anymore. They were handling time that had refused to stay buried. Inside, the fragments of paper were worse than expected. Not because they were gruesome, because they were structured. The handwriting, though faded, followed patterns. Repeated intervals. Notes separated by dates spanning months, sometimes years. Each entry was short, almost clinical, stripped of emotion but heavy with observation. Distances between locations. Time gaps between sightings. References to movement windows and patterns repeating. One line, barely legible, stood out enough to be flagged immediately. "Stop point changes everything." Detective Ortega read it twice. Then a third time. Because that phrase, "stop point," echoed too closely with something Thomas Grady had been repeating since the beginning. She shouldn't have stopped. Ortega returned to the interrogation room without hesitation. Grady looked up the moment he entered, as if he already knew something had shifted. "You found the container," Grady said. It wasn't a question. Ortega didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a copy of the recovered notes on the table. Grady didn't reach for them. He didn't need to. Ortega watched his reaction carefully. "You recognize this," Ortega said. Grady exhaled slowly. "I remember it," he corrected. That distinction mattered. Ortega leaned forward. Explain. Grady hesitated, longer than before. Not confusion. Not evasion. Something closer to constraint, like he was deciding how much structure he could reveal without collapsing the entire narrative he had been holding together. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. She kept changing her route, he said. Ortega frowned slightly. Emily. Grady nodded. At first it was small differences. Leaving work earlier. Stopping for things she didn't usually stop for. Ortega's expression tightened. There's no record of that. Grady's eyes lifted. Because you weren't looking for patterns. You were looking for an endpoint. The statement landed heavily. Outside, analysts were still processing the implication of the recovered notes. The idea that someone had been tracking movement patterns, not just events, was reshaping how the entire investigation was being interpreted. What had once been a disappearance was now being reviewed as a sequence of positional changes over time. A behavioral map, not a single incident. Back inside the room, Ortega pressed forward. You're saying she was being tracked. Grady didn't answer directly. But he didn't deny it either. Instead, he said, she noticed it. That changed everything again. Because it placed Emily Harper not just as a victim of a single night, but as someone potentially aware of irregularities before that night ever happened. Ortega's voice dropped. She noticed you. Grady paused, then nodded slightly. Eventually. The word eventually carried more weight than anything else in the room, because it implied progression. Escalation. Awareness over time. Ortega felt the structure of the case shift again. You were interacting with her before she disappeared, he said. Grady didn't correct him, but he didn't confirm it either. Instead, he added, not how you think. That sentence created immediate tension. Ortega leaned in. Then how? Grady looked down at the table. She was reacting. The room went silent. Outside, the lab team had moved from analyzing paper fragments to cross-referencing the handwriting patterns with known samples from the Harper household. Early comparisons suggested none of the writing belonged to Emily Harper, which meant the notes were not hers. And if Grady's implication was accurate, they weren't written by a single observer either. Ortega returned with that information. Grady listened without reacting immediately, then said, that's why it never stayed in one place. Ortega's eyes narrowed. You're talking about movement again. Grady nodded. Because that's what it was. Ortega felt frustration rising. Stop describing it like a system. Someone took her. Someone killed her. That's what we're dealing with. Grady finally looked at him directly. And that's why you're missing pieces. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Because for the first time, Grady wasn't simply refusing to answer. He was challenging the framework of the investigation itself. Outside, a new forensic report arrived from the excavation team. The third site had revealed something unexpected beneath soil layers previously believed undisturbed. A secondary depression. Smaller. Older. Aligned geographically in a way that suggested intentional spacing between sites across time. Not random dumping points, but structured locations. Almost like markers. When Ortega saw the report, something in him tightened. He returned to Grady immediately. This isn't one site, Ortega said. It's multiple. Grady nodded slightly. Yes. Ortega's voice sharpened. Why? Grady hesitated, then answered quietly. Because stopping wasn't consistent. That phrase again. Ortega felt it locking into place. You keep going back to that, he said. Stopping. As if it mattered more than anything else. Grady's expression shifted slightly. Because it did. A long silence followed. Then Ortega asked the question that had been building since the first interrogation. Grady didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Everything else had to adjust. The statement was no longer abstract. It now aligned with physical evidence. Multiple sites. Repeated disturbances. Movement patterns. Recovered notes tracking positions over time. It was forming a structure that didn't behave like a single criminal act. It behaved like adaptation. Ortega stepped back slightly. You're describing ongoing activity. Grady didn't deny it. And that was when Ortega realized the most unsettling part of all this wasn't what had been discovered. It was what had not yet been fully understood. Because every layer uncovered so far suggested continuity. Not closure. Not a finished event buried in the past. But something that had changed shape over time and left traces in multiple places without ever resolving into a single, stable truth. Outside, Ash Creek was no longer reacting like a town recovering a solved case. It was reacting like a system that had just realized it had only been seeing fragments of something far larger than it expected. And inside the interrogation room, Thomas Grady sat quietly, no longer resisting the investigation's direction. Because from his perspective, it was never a question of whether the truth existed. It was whether anyone was finally prepared to see all of it at once. By the time the sun rose over Ash Creek, the town no longer felt like it belonged to itself. It felt occupied by headlines, by theories, by the slow, suffocating realization that every version of Emily Harper's disappearance they had believed for 27 years might have been incomplete in ways no one wanted to admit out loud. Inside the sheriff's office, the interrogation room had become something closer to a pressure chamber. Every hour that passed seemed to compress the space between Detective Ortega and Thomas Grady, not physically, but in terms of meaning, like the distance between question and answer was collapsing into something denser, harder to interpret. Grady sat the same way he had for days now. Still, measured, not resisting anymore in the traditional sense, but no longer offering anything that resembled clarity either. Ortega studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You keep saying she noticed patterns," Ortega said. "You keep saying she changed routes. But nothing in the original investigation supports that level of awareness." Grady's eyes lifted slightly. "Because it wasn't in your records," he replied. That answer again. Always circling the gap between recorded truth and unrecorded experience. Ortega leaned forward. "Then tell me what she saw." For a moment, Grady didn't respond. Outside, a patrol car passed slowly in front of the building, its tires cutting through wet pavement with a sound that felt too loud for the stillness inside. When Grady finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "She noticed the same things repeating," he said. Ortega frowned. "What things?" Grady hesitated. "Vehicles." That single word sharpened the air in the room. Ortega didn't interrupt. Grady continued. "Not always mine. That's what made it harder to explain." Ortega felt something tighten. "You're saying there were multiple vehicles near her?" Grady nodded slightly. "Not at the same time. Not always in the same place." The implications settled slowly. Because it introduced a structure investigators hadn't fully considered until now. Not a single offender pattern, but overlapping presence patterns across time. Ortega's voice lowered. "Other suspects." Grady didn't confirm or deny it directly. Instead, he said, "You think everything centers on one point because that's how cases are usually built." That sentence struck a nerve. Because it was true in a procedural sense. Investigations are designed to converge toward a singular responsible actor, a clean resolution point where evidence aligns into one narrative. But Grady was suggesting something that resisted that structure entirely. Ortega stood slightly. "You're implying she wasn't just interacting with you." Grady looked at him for a long moment. "I'm saying she wasn't alone in what she noticed." The words created immediate tension, because they reframed Emily Harper not as a passive subject of disappearance, but as someone potentially navigating a broader environment of awareness before her final moments. Outside, forensic analysts were now reprocessing older witness statements with this new framework in mind. One detail from 1998 resurfaced again, this time with different weight. A diner coworker had once mentioned Emily becoming unusually quiet in the weeks before she vanished. At the time, it was interpreted as stress from school or work. Now, investigators were reconsidering whether that quietness reflected observation rather than withdrawal. Back in the interrogation room, Ortega returned with another document. "This," he said, sliding it across the table, "is a compiled timeline reconstruction based on new evidence. It shows overlapping vehicle presence near Emily's routes over a 6-week period before she disappeared." Grady glanced at it, then nodded once. "That's closer," he said. Ortega narrowed his eyes. "To what?" Grady hesitated. "To what she was seeing." Ortega felt frustration rise again. "You're still not naming anyone else." Grady's expression didn't change. "Because naming assumes separation," he said. "And separation is what you're still trying to force into this." That line hung in the air. Outside, a second excavation report came in from the third site. Deeper analysis of soil composition suggested that some of the disturbances weren't just revisitations. They may have involved partial removal and reburial of materials across different time periods. The forensic geologist attached a note. This indicates deliberate redistribution of evidence over time. Ortega read it twice, then a third time. When he returned to the room, his tone was sharper. "You're talking about movement again," he said. "But this isn't just movement. This is manipulation of locations over time." Grady nodded slightly. "Yes." Ortega leaned forward. "Why?" For a moment, Grady didn't answer. Then he said something that shifted the entire emotional tone of the room. "Because it couldn't stay in one place." Ortega's expression hardened. "Stop saying that." Grady looked at him. "I'm not describing it the way you want," he said. "I'm describing it the way it happened." A pause. Then Ortega asked the question that had been building across every layer of this case. "Where is she now?" Silence. Longer than before. Grady looked down at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost flat. "Not where you think." Ortega's patience finally cracked slightly. "That's not an answer." Grady looked up. "It is," he said. "Just not a complete one." That distinction mattered, because it aligned with everything investigators were now seeing in the evidence. Fragmented recovery, multiple sites, inconsistent distribution of remains and personal effects, a pattern that refused to consolidate into a single conclusion. Outside, Ash Creek had begun to shift again. The arrest of Thomas Grady had initially created the expectation of resolution. Instead, each new discovery was expanding the boundaries of the case. Reporters were no longer asking when the case would be solved. They were asking whether it ever could be understood fully. Back inside, Ortega took a slower approach. He placed a different photo on the table. The charm bracelet recovered from the first excavation site. Emily's initials still visible. "This belonged to her," Ortega said. Grady looked at it. Something changed in his expression. Not guilt, not shock, but recognition layered with something harder to define. "Parts of it did," he said. Ortega's voice lowered. "Explain that." Grady hesitated, then said, "It wasn't kept whole." The room went still again, because that phrase aligned too precisely with earlier statements about distribution across sites. Ortega leaned forward. "You're saying she was separated after death." Grady didn't respond directly. Instead, he said, "You're still thinking in final states." That line hit differently than the rest, because it implied continuity even beyond what investigators were framing as resolution points. Ortega felt the structure of the case shift again, but this time in a way that was harder to stabilize. "You're refusing to define a single event," Ortega said. Grady looked at him steadily. "Because there wasn't just one," he replied. And for the first time since the interrogation began, the idea that had been forming across fragments of evidence, soil layers, repeated disturbances, overlapping timelines, recovered notes tracking movement patterns, stopped feeling like interpretation. It started feeling like structure. Outside, Ash Creek's morning light broke through the clouds, casting long reflections across wet streets. But inside the sheriff's office, there was no sense of daylight meaning clarity. Only the slow realization that what had been buried for 27 years was not a singular story waiting to be uncovered. It was a system of events that had never fully stopped unfolding. By the 10th day since the arrest, Ash Creek had stopped reacting like a town that had solved a case. It was reacting like a town trapped inside one. The courthouse steps stayed crowded from morning to night. News vans never moved. Social media feeds refreshed in an endless loop of speculation, fragments of leaked reports, and shaky reconstructions of what people believed had happened to Emily Harper. Every new detail that emerged didn't settle the narrative, it split it further. Inside the sheriff's office, the interrogation room had developed its own strange atmosphere. Not tense anymore in the usual sense. More like suspended, time no longer moving in a straight line, but circling the same unanswered center. Detective Ortega had stopped expecting simple answers from Thomas Grady. What he expected now was structure, patterns, consistency and inconsistency. And Grady, whether intentionally or not, continued to provide exactly that. Ortega placed a new report on the table. "This came back from forensic review," he said. Grady didn't look immediately. Ortega continued. "It's a reconstructed environmental map of all 3 excavation sites. Soil displacement, sediment layering, disturbance intervals. They've overlaid it with historical land access data." Now Grady looked. Not quickly. carefully, like he was checking whether the structure matched something already stored in his memory. Ortega watched him closely. What does it show? Ortega asked. Grady exhaled slowly. It shows spacing, he said. Ortega frowned. Spacing. Grady nodded once. Equal gaps. Not random. Measured. That word mattered. Measured implied intent. Repetition. Control over placement across time. Ortega leaned forward. Measured by who? Grady didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said, You keep assuming it has a beginning. The statement landed heavily, because it challenged the entire foundation of how the investigation had been constructed since 1998. Every case file, every timeline, every reconstruction assumed a starting point, the night Emily Harper disappeared. But Grady was suggesting something else entirely. A system that didn't originate in a single moment. Ortega's voice sharpened. If there's no beginning, then what are we even looking at? Grady looked up. A pattern that changed states, he said quietly. Outside, analysts were still processing the implications of the spatial mapping. One forensic specialist described it as nonlinear distribution, meaning the sites didn't follow a straightforward chronological progression. Instead, they appeared to be arranged in a way that suggested adaptation over time, as if each event adjusted the conditions for the next. Inside the room, Ortega felt that idea settle uncomfortably. You're describing behavior over time, he said, but you're avoiding responsibility. Grady didn't react to the accusation. Instead, he said, I'm describing what I saw continue. Ortega paused. What does that mean? Grady hesitated. Then more quietly. Things didn't stop when she stopped. That phrase again. But this time it didn't feel like repetition. It felt like anchor. Ortega leaned in. Explain what stopped means. Grady looked at him. And for the first time, there was something almost exhausted in his expression. Her movement changed, he said. Ortega frowned. Her movement. Grady nodded. She didn't follow the same routes anymore. That detail shifted the tone again, because it aligned with earlier claims about route variation, but now it was being framed as behavioral deviation rather than coincidence. Ortega pressed. Why would she change routes? Grady didn't answer immediately. Instead, she noticed. That word again. Not fear. Not victimhood. Awareness. Ortega felt the investigation tilt slightly. You're saying she was aware of being observed. Grady didn't confirm it directly, but he didn't deny it either. And that absence of denial carried weight. Outside, a new witness statement arrived at the sheriff's office. This one came from a former high school classmate of Emily Harper who had not been interviewed in the original investigation. Her statement was short but precise. She mentioned feeling like she was being followed in the weeks before she disappeared. Not scared, just aware. Like she noticed the same presence in different places. That phrase, same presence, echoed uncomfortably with the emerging pattern of overlapping vehicle sightings. Ortega read it once, then again, then walked back into the interrogation room without hesitation. He placed the statement on the table. Grady read it, then nodded slightly. That's closer, he said. Ortega's tone sharpened. Closer to what? Grady looked at him. To what she experienced. A pause. Then Ortega asked the question that had been building for days. Did she confront you? Grady hesitated. Longer than before. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. She didn't confront anyone. That answer changed the framing again, because it implied observation without engagement. Awareness without direct interaction. A state of recognition that didn't necessarily result in confrontation. Ortega leaned forward. Then what happened on the night she disappeared? Grady looked down at the table, and for a long moment he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was almost flat. She stopped where she wasn't supposed to stop. Ortega's frustration broke slightly. You keep returning to that. Why does that moment matter more than everything else? Grady looked up slowly. Because that's where the pattern broke. Silence. The room felt heavier now, not because of tension, but because of structure collapsing into something harder to interpret. Ortega exhaled slowly. What pattern? Grady didn't answer immediately. Then, the distance pattern. That phrase introduced something new. Ortega frowned. Explain. Grady hesitated. She kept changing how far she would go before stopping. That detail reframed earlier interpretations again. It wasn't just route variation. It was distance variation, behavioral measurement over time. Ortega felt something shift. You were tracking her distances. Grady shook his head slightly. I was noticing them. The distinction mattered again. Observation versus action. But the line between them was becoming harder to define. Outside, investigators re-examined the recovered notes from the sealed container. One analyst identified what appeared to be repeated measurements written in shorthand, notations that resembled distance tracking between known points. When Ortega returned with that information, Grady didn't react with surprise. Instead, he said, "That's why I kept the notes." Ortega's voice dropped. "You wrote them." Grady paused. Then, "Not all of them." That sentence introduced instability again. Multiple contributors, or multiple interpretations of the same system. Ortega felt the case structure bending once more. "You're suggesting more than one person documented this," he said. Grady didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. Instead, he said something that reframed everything again. Different people noticed different parts. That line lingered longer than the rest, because it suggested distributed awareness across time, not centralized